And welcome back, everybody. So this week, today, tonight, the morning, whenever you're watching this, we are going to be taking a look at Reconstruction. Now, some of you are like, what's Reconstruction? What are we reconstructing? Why is something broken? Well, if you've been paying attention to that whole Civil War thing, you will have realized that, yeah, the Civil War was bad and bad things happened, like all over the South. Lots of people died, like 620,000 or more. Anyways, lots of rebuilding has to go on, guys. This is why we call it Reconstruction. And so we're going to be taking a look at that today. Again, if you have no idea what I'm talking about with this, man, you're like lost. You're like, what? You need to go back and view those other videos. Take some time, learn about the Civil War, learn about the causes of the Civil War. Now, I'm going to go ahead and warn you guys up front. This lesson is going to be a little bit longer than the ones that we've done previously, okay? Because we're going to try and get this taken care of kind of all at once, because it's all kind of one big thing that happens. And to sort of break it up, there's no real good middle point on this. So we're just going to kind of push through it and get it knocked out for you guys. Okay. So let me go ahead and get the screen up here. While I'm doing that, do make sure you have your notes sheet and ready to go. All right, guys. So again, it's called Reconstruction. Now in just a minute here, I'm going to give you that definition of Reconstruction. Oh, there we go. Now you can see me even better. Isn't that awesome? And technology, great. Okay. So here's the thing, guys. So Reconstruction. So what was it? It was basically the time period of rebuilding the South post-Civil War era. Okay, now it lasted from 1865 to 1877. So in that 12 years, lots of things happened. I mean, the turmoil just continued. So all the turmoil that we looked at that led up to the Civil War, then obviously you have the Civil War, and that just all kinds of turmoil. But those next 12 years, guys, things don't really settle down. They just sort of shift where things are going on, okay? Now, you may be wondering yourself, well, why does it end in 1877? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's actually called the Compromise of 1877. And if you've been paying attention, you know that every other compromise that we've had in the country up until this point was a terrible failure for the most part. And this one really not a whole lot different, to be honest. But that's something you'll learn a whole lot more in another class. Just know that the end of Reconstruction comes with the Compromise of 1877, okay? All right, so first of all, you need to understand that President Lincoln had a plan. He had a plan very early on, actually. The idea was he always believed that the Union was going to be preserved. At least he publicly believed that. Now, in some of his internal writings and internal struggles, he didn't know, and this was a really emotional thing for him. He believed in preserving the Union so much. And so he had to have a plan in place. And his is what's known as the 10% plan. It gets its name because he said 10% of the voting population in 1860. If they took a oath of loyalty, bam, then, you know, things can get going, okay? It was a fairly simple and really, in a lot of ways, guys, almost too easy on the South in a lot of ways. But as you'll see, he's got some friends in the Republican Party that kind of think a little differently on this. What he would end up replacing a majority rule concept with loyalty rule in the South. So if you weren't really willing to pledge your oath to the United States, then you couldn't participate in the process. Okay. He also had this idea he wanted to pardon all but the highest ranking military and civilian Confederate officers. Okay, so this is all part of that saying, you know what, listen, we've had our problems, we've had our differences, but we need to find ways to start moving forward, because otherwise this is going to get really bad really fast. And this is Lincoln's vision. Okay, unfortunately for the country and for Lincoln, and well, pretty much us today, even to a great extent, Lincoln was assassinated on April 15th, 1865, basically less than 1 week after the end of the Civil War. So think about this for a minute, guys. He comes into office, and there's already 7 states who have seceded from the Union by the time he's sworn into office. And by the time the Civil War ends, 1 week, less than a week later, he's killed. I mean, his presidency literally goes from beginning to end of the Civil War, and that's it. Okay? So he was killed by none other than a man by the name of John Wilkes Booth, who actually, by the way, was a famous actor, which explains why no one noticed that he was just sort of around Ford's Theater, okay? This is kind of one of those things that a lot of people are like, how was he able to just be there? Well, around the president. Well, 1, security was a lot different then, but 2, he was a famous actor. People knew him, so it made sense that he might be there, okay? Now, he is also when he killed Lincoln, he is said to have said "Sic semper tyrannis," which means basically, of the tyrants, the South is avenged. And so this was his final act of, avenging the defeat of the South. Okay, so because of Lincoln's assassination, everything falls to Andrew Johnson, the vice president at the time. Now we are always going to call him President Andrew Johnson. And so Johnson had a little bit different ideas on some things, but he did agree with Lincoln on one key point, and that the states had never actually legally left the Union. So from that perspective, how do you readmit them if they never actually left? Okay, and so this is a much more even. He's actually a little more to the radical side than Lincoln was, but he still did not believe in sort of how could you go for revenge if you never left? They didn't really, anyhow. But this becomes a key point when we take a look at the other plans that were out there. In particular, when we take a look at the Wade-Davis Bill of 1864. And this comes from a group called the Radical Republicans, and they favored drastic and repressive measures against the southern states. Okay, they, instead of being at that 10% level like Lincoln would have been, they believed the majority of white males had to pledge a loyalty to the United States. Okay, and this is a big difference. You think about it, guys. If you got to get, say, 51% versus 10%, that's a huge difference, and it's going to take a lot longer to get that settled. Okay, and they also believe that only white males who swore they had not fought for the Confederate States of America, or CSA, they could be the only ones that could vote for new state conventions, constitutional conventions rather, and they believe that all new state constitutions had to specifically ban slavery. Now, not a lot of these things are actually really good things, and I think that had Lincoln lived and not been killed, I think they would have ended up somewhere in the middle. This is just sort of my opinion on things and how things normally would have worked with Lincoln. But Johnson, on the other hand, Johnson was not Lincoln. He did not have the charisma. He did not have the ability to get what he wanted like Lincoln did. Lincoln was actually quite the master politician in a lot of ways. He was able to accomplish things when he was in the Illinois legislature as a sort of an unknown. Okay, and so if you ever get a chance, take a look at some of his stuff. It's actually pretty impressive. Okay. All right. So hopefully you guys are caught up on the notes. So let me a second here. All right. So one of the key things, though, that Lincoln did institute is what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau was important for a number of reasons. And this picture here shows that the carpetbaggers that came down south, and there's a lot of negative things that came about from the Freedmen's Bureau, but there were also some really good positive things as well. So the Freedmen's Bureau was a federal department that was designed to assist freed slaves and poor whites, helping provide food and housing and medical aid and big deal, established schools. They also offered legal assistance, but guys, that establishing of schools is one of the really great legacies of the Reconstruction era. Okay, so because you'll remember way back when we looked at the differences in North and South, one of the things that I told you was that not only was the North more industrialized, but they had more schools. When we looked at the reform movements, a lot of that stuff did not take hold as much in the South. But thanks to the Freedmen's Bureau, there's more schools, more education. It actually helps to lead to more industrialization, all these good things that are actually beneficial in the long run for the South. Now, another thing that happened, though, is you had this group of Northern abolitionists who would come down as a part of this and worked with the Freedmen's Bureau and did some other things. They, honestly, guys, they were really risking their lives to help Southern freedmen. Okay, now there were some that had good intentions, and there were others who did not. So it was a bit of a mixed bag. And you had groups like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, who basically said, look, if you're going to help the freed slaves, we'll kill you. That's really what they did and what they were there for, is in part, and they stoked fear. So this is really what's all associated with the Freedmen's Bureau. As you can imagine, many people in the South did not have a positive view of the Freedmen's Bureau. There's many political cartoons out there that really depicted this idea of, basically this idea of had all this food and nothing to do, that type of thing. And that's what they would promote about it. Now, also in December of 1865, you had the 13th Amendment. Okay, now the 13th Amendment is what actually officially abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude, except as a form of punishment for a crime. That's important. Just want you to know that. So involuntary servitude can actually be a form of punishment even after the 13th Amendment. Now, Congress, is very interesting how it's worded, because this is where Congress starts to try and take control of the situation and basically remove it from the presidency and into the hands of Congress. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And it was, again, there's this power struggle, right? Congress is trying to take back power that the presidency has had throughout the war. And so there's this struggle back and forth between the two. Okay. Now, also in this area, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, it declared that all persons born in the United States were now citizens without regard to race, color, or previous condition. This, of course, is a huge deal. If you remember back to the Dred Scott decision, the reason that Dred Scott, the big reason, the decision out of that case was that he had no standing. He was not a citizen, so he could not sue for his freedom. Okay, this was the sort of the legal basis of what the Supreme Court decided. Well, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 basically overturns that. Now, of course, Dred Scott, there was no slavery anymore because of the 13th Amendment, but the concept that he was not a citizen, had no right to standing from a legal perspective, was now eliminated with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, it was actually originally vetoed by Johnson. Now, it's not so much that Johnson had a particular problem with a lot of this. There was a number of reasons why he vetoed it. It's inherently because he actually saw a lot of states' rights issues. He really believed that it wasn't the job of the federal government to make all of these huge decisions for every single state. Okay, and that's really at the core part of why he vetoed it. But for the first time in U.S. history, his veto was overturned by a 2/3 majority. Okay, cool. So you guys remember from civics that 2/3. Anyways, all right. So what was the radical plan for readmission? Well, it's good stuff. It's radical. Things like civil authorities in the territories were subject to military supervision. Now you'll notice it says territories and not states. Remember how you said that Lincoln and Johnson believed that the states never legally left. That means they were actually technically still states. The radical Republicans, on the other hand, they basically saw they had left and they were territories now. So they had to be completely readmitted, just like any other territory had to be. And they were subject to military rule. This is what we would say now is military occupation. Okay. Now, a couple of other things that require new state constitutions, that would include things like black suffrage, ratification of the 13th and 14th Amendment. And just so you know, the way they sort of determine which of these were territories and not states anymore, didn't necessarily have to do, ironically enough, with exactly who seceded. It really actually had more to do with which states had said, which areas or states or whatever you want to call them, were not going to ratify the 14th Amendment, which we'll get to. Okay, but for them to become states, they had to agree to the 13th and 14th Amendment. In March of 1867, Congress passed an act that authorized the military to enroll eligible black voters. So you'll notice it's always the military that they're going to. It's a military-style occupation, military rule. That was the radical plan for readmission. Okay, so there's that. All right, let me see. Let's get to the next one. Now, you did have what's a series of acts in 1867 known sort of collectively as the Reconstruction Acts. Okay, so let's take a look. So the first one we have here is what's called Command of the Army Act. Now, this is where Congress comes along and basically tells the president what he has to do. Okay, now remember, things have already been vetoed and then overturned. So at this point, really and truly, Johnson really starts to lose a lot of presidential authority and power. And they tell him that the president must issue all Reconstruction orders through the commander of the military. So he can't go outside of that. And remember, it is Congress who's really controlling what the military does. They're telling the military what to do. Now, this is superseding the presidential authority as commander-in-chief. Okay, and we'll get to something else here in just a minute where you see, again, the Congress goes after clear constitutional authority. All right. Now, this is with the Tenure of Office Act. Now, the Tenure of Office Act is one of the most unconstitutional laws that was ever done. And so basically what Congress said is that the president cannot remove any officials without the Senate's consent if the position originally required Senate approval. So for example, all the cabinet positions, constitutionally, the president says, I want this person to be, at this time, maybe say Secretary of War. And then the Senate is advised and consent. In other words, this person had to get Senate approval to be on the Secretary of War. Well, once they become Secretary of War, the president could then fire them. Okay. Tenure of Office Act says, no, you can't do that. Actually, if it requires Senate approval to hire them, basically, it's going to require Senate approval to fire them. Okay, now there's some serious constitutional questions about this, and all truthfulness, guys, it is an obviously unconstitutional law. But it was the law of the land at the time, okay? And so it was designed with a purpose in mind. One was to protect the radical members of Lincoln's government, okay? So this is why it was put in place. So Lincoln had set up the government and everything, and Johnson comes along, and Johnson realizes, wait a minute, there's some problems here. I got to start maybe getting rid of some of these folks who are a little more radical. I need some support and all those kinds of things. And so the radical Republicans go, let's protect them. Let's keep them in these positions of authority and power, okay? And so this is, in particular, one of those gentlemen is a man by the name of Edwin Stanton. Okay, now you've probably never heard of Edwin Stanton, okay, but he becomes a very key figure in the impeachment of President Johnson. Okay, so again, it was designed to protect radical members of Lincoln's government, and there was huge questions to the constitutionality of it. Okay, now another act in this time period was called the Military Reconstruction Act. All right, so to restart the Reconstruction in the 10 southern states that refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, they divided those 10 unreconstructed states, as they were called, or sometimes territories, different things, different people refer to different ways, into 5 military districts. Okay, and so you can kind of see this here. So you see places like you have Texas and Louisiana were a district, Arkansas and Mississippi were one, Tennessee was its own, Florida, Georgia, Alabama were one, the 2 Carolinas were a district, and then Virginia was its own district. The reason really and truly that Virginia gets its own district is because it is by far the most populous, is the most powerful. That's where the capital was for the South and those kinds of things. Tennessee gets its own really because they actually get accepted back in, if you will, fairly quickly. The military rule over Tennessee is really the shortest of any of the southern states. So that's really why they're kind of their own and life can move on. Okay. And then the others have a lot more to do with population or size. I mean, there's not a lot of folks, relatively speaking, in Florida. That's why it gets lumped with Georgia and Alabama, things like that. Okay. All right. Now, I mentioned to you earlier, President Johnson's impeachment. Okay. So Johnson basically removed Stanton, who was the Secretary of War. So by the Tenure of Office Act, that he was violating the law. So technically speaking, if you violate the law as president, you can be brought up on impeachment charges. Okay. So in that sense, the impeachment of Johnson by the House, because that's how the impeachment process works. First, the House of Representatives, typically what they do is they bring up articles of impeachment and then they vote on them. That's not exactly what happened here, but they do start to, basically it's kind of like this first step in a trial. Okay, you have what's called like a grand jury is this idea. And the House of Representatives sort of acts in that role to say, yes, there's something here that the president has violated the law. Okay, high crimes and misdemeanors is actually how the Constitution has it. Now, the other thing that Johnson was doing that really angered a lot of radical Republicans, he was replacing generals who were more sympathetic to radical Reconstruction. So those generals that were overseeing these military districts, he was moving them on and getting more that were not so radical, more aligned with what he believed. Now, this is well within his rights, right? This would have been as commander-in-chief. This is what his job could be. This is something he should be able to do. This angered a lot of radical Republicans. So they were looking for that one thing, and when he removed Stanton in February of 1868, they seized upon that. Okay. Now the House actually impeached him fairly quickly. Get it? He was removed in February of 68, and by February 24th, they had already voted to impeach. Now, interestingly enough, they didn't actually have the articles of impeachment actually written by the time or drawn up but by the time they voted on it, which is like they voted on the charges before they had written up the charges, whatever. But the vote was 126 to 47, very lopsided. Clearly, Johnson has now been impeached. Now, part of the impeachment process then is that it then goes to the Senate, is the idea here. And there's actually a bit of pomp and circumstance usually where they take the charges, when they finally get them written, apparently, they take them over to the Senate, and the Senate then has a trial. Okay, now as typically what happens is that it is the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court acts as the judge, and then you have essentially you have the prosecution, you have a defense, and it's a trial. Now this particular trial actually lasted 11 weeks, nearly 3 full months of this. They even actually had tickets you could get. It was almost a big spectacle. Not that we would know anything in this country about the impeachment trials being a big spectacle, because that's what they pretty much always are. And so that's what happens here. Now Johnson actually gets acquitted in the Senate by 1 vote. They were 1 vote shy of having the 2/3 majority needed to convict. Now, had they gotten that, then he would have been removed from office, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he was acquitted. So in that sense, it was a win. But again, guys, honestly, the law was unconstitutional to begin with. So technically, did he violate the law? Yes, he violated an unconstitutional law. So there you go. All right. Now, let's see what we got here. We got you that one. Now, for these last few things, I have a special guest for you guys, okay? So give me some moment. Let me see if I can get him, see if he's actually done what he's supposed to do and is ready for this. Hey, it's my Tomlin friends. I've made it back, man. I want to finish up this lesson. I was so excited when Mr. Bailey told me I might have one last chance to hang out with you guys. So I'm here. I made it. Let's get rolling with this. So, it looks like you guys just finished the Senate trial on Johnson's impeachment, which again, crazy stuff. All right. What do we got next? What do you guys? Oh, 14th Amendment. Yeah, it's a great amendment. Great, good stuff. It was actually ratified July of 1868, provided a constitutional guarantee. This is important, constitutional guarantee. Whereas before this, you would have civil rights acts, but laws can easily be overturned and changed, right? But constitutional amendments, man, that's hard. So once you get it into the Constitution as an amendment, it's far more guaranteed than if it's just a law on the books. That's really what's going on here. And so with the 14th Amendment, provide a constitutional guarantee for the security and of freed people, i.e. former slaves, is mainly what we're going for here in this 14th Amendment. And also including the southern states would be punished for denying the right to vote to Black citizens. So this is a part of that radical Republican concept of punishing the South. There was this idea from radical Republicans that you caused all this mess, you're inherently bad people, and we're going to force this on you no matter what you think, and we're going to punish you. We're going to use the military to do it. And I'm not saying that they were wrong, guys. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying this wasn't a totally bad idea, sort of force these things through. But understand, if you're the one having things forced on you, you might resent it a little bit. And this starts to boil and bubble up within the South. Okay, and this is where actually Lincoln was very afraid of these kinds of things happening. That's why his original plan was at 10%, much more welcoming. Arms wrapped around, we're all in this, thing, whatever. And he was very, very afraid that that fragile psyche would snap again, and we'd be right back where we were during the Civil War. Okay, and so this was the balance. And so, honest to goodness, guys, the Reconstruction era, there are people that live in the South today that are still bitter about things that happened in the Reconstruction era. Trust me, there just are, okay? And it doesn't make it right, but they really are, okay? Now, also in this area, you had the 15th Amendment. It was ratified in 1870, and it is actually the one that guaranteed African-American men the right to vote. Now, if you remember way back when I talked to you about, or you guys talked about the 19th century reform movements, the women were fighting for the right to vote. And they didn't get it for like 100 years. But African-American men, former slaves, they had the right to vote all of a sudden. And this made so many of the women's groups furious, because you had the white women who were looking around going, wait, he gets to vote before me? Because remember what I've told you last time I was with you. I told you about the North, right? And the South. And the North was not exactly, everybody's equal. This is a big misconception in U.S. history. So you basically had a bunch of racists in the North, and particularly you had racist white women who were looking around going, wait a minute, why does he get to vote and I don't? And then you had all the African-American women going, wait a minute, why does he get to vote and I don't? So basically, all the women's groups got furious with this, okay? So, yeah, it was good, but really? Like, that's the step we're going to take? All right. So now, what happened with blacks in Southern politics? Now, the core black voters were actually veterans. So they had fought on the side of the North during the war. So this is your core group of voters particularly in the Southern politics. A lot of folks say they're politically unprepared, which means they weren't used to being in politics, and there's a certain gamesmanship that goes with being in politics, the give and the take and the backroom deals and all these things. They just weren't prepared for it, so they didn't do really well with it at first. Now, interestingly enough, too, now blacks could actually register to vote in states since 1867. So within 2 years, that military making them eligible to vote, registering them to vote, that actually happened fairly quickly. Now, of course, the southern states would actually push, southern folks in southern states, a lot of them would push back against this, okay? So they had developed what we call the Black Codes. And these were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans. It prevented them from, particularly from voting, for example. And if you can't vote, that means you're not hold offices for the most part, which means you don't hold the political power. They also help to ensure that their availability as a cheap labor force. All right. Now, this cheap labor force actually is an important part of this, because it really forced many of the blacks to become what's called sharecroppers or tenant farmers, which in all truthfulness really wasn't a whole lot different than slavery. Yes, they had certain legal guarantees that the slaves did not, they did not have, but as far as the actual practical everyday life, not a whole lot different. Because what you had is you had all these plantations, and the former slaves would rent their little plot of land. They would rent the tools and rent everything that they needed from the plantation owners. And after all that payment was done, they virtually had no money left, so they were stuck there. So it really wasn't, from a practical standpoint, significantly different. But on the one other hand, though, it was different because they were actually there was some little bit larger sense of control, and that if you wanted to maybe try and move to another spot, maybe you could. And so, again, it's a baby step for them. But in all practical terms, for most of that, particularly that first generation after the Civil War, there's really no practical difference for them. Now, that does not mean that there were not great success stories early on in the Reconstruction era. You actually had a number of black senators and to House of Representatives, and you had them in state legislatures, and all these things. There were pockets and there were groups. And in fact, in some states, the majority of the voters were actually Black. In Florida, they were about 50-50. For example, you had in, I believe it was Louisiana, it was about 60-40. So the majority of the voters actually were Black for a period of time. So you had these things going on as well that were great success stories. You also had the really terrible side of all this. And it is after the Civil War that you actually see the Ku Klux Klan come into existence. Okay, and so this is called the Invisible Empire of the South. Okay, and it is a terrible, terrible part of Southern and American history. Again, the KKK really comes about as a lot of former Confederate soldiers and leaders realize that they want to be, they have to sort of publicly renounce the Confederacy, but privately and in secret, hence the hoods and these things, they would still push through on this. And so they worked through intimidation and fear. They would become very prominent at different points in history. Their numbers would go up and down and up and down, and in particular when we get to the about 100 years after all this, in the 1960s, their numbers and their reigns of terror are quite visible and very terrible. They are known for their lynchings, the shootings, burning of crosses, these kinds of terrible things. And so this is what's called the Invisible Empire of the South. Okay, guys, so that wraps up Reconstruction. I'm so excited that I got to be the one to wrap up Reconstruction with you. And so it covers so much. Reconstruction is such a volatile time period. You have things like the carpetbaggers coming down. You have military occupation. You have the Compromise of 1877, which really what happens in that is that the military occupation ends, and without the military there to enforce the various civil rights acts and laws, you have the Black codes become more predominant. And then is what's called the Jim Crow era, which is basically where they did not specifically say that if you are Black, you could not vote, but you did have things like a poll tax. So if you didn't have enough money, you couldn't vote. Or literacy, if you couldn't read or write to a certain way, then you couldn't vote. Or they had grandfather clauses, all these different things that were technically not about a particular race, but the reality is they really were. And so this grows once the military occupation of the military designations and the military leaves, then these things come into play. And you had a lot of the basically you have the Democrat political party actually takes a hold of the South, and they dominate Southern politics for for well over a century. And and it doesn't start to get cleaned up again until right at 100 years later in the 1960s. And this is where you hear about folks like Martin Luther King, and you have the various civil rights acts and all these things come into play. So, all right, guys. So I hope that this has all made sense to you. I know that Reconstruction is a lot of information. It's a lot of stuff. And I know Mr. Bailey covered a bunch of it. I got to cover a bunch of it. I hope it all made sense to you. If it doesn't, man, reach out to Mr. Bailey. I'm sure he will help you out. All right, guys. Well, I've been so excited I was able to join you again. Unfortunately, this is going to be my last time with you. My schedule is like crazy booked through the rest of May. I know, hard to imagine my schedule booked. I know, crazy, huh? But it is. But I hope you guys have a good rest of your May and an amazing summer coming up. Stay safe out there, guys. See ya.